There's a man in a neuroimaging laboratory at Stanford University. He is not a patient. He is a specimen. The fMRI scan running above his skull is mapping what happens, biologically, structurally, at the level of individual prefrontal dendrites, when a human being receives a predictable, monthly financial reward. And what the imaging reveals is not prosperity. It is not freedom. It is addiction. The high-income trap is not a metaphor. It is not a self-help abstraction for people who feel vaguely dissatisfied at expensive restaurants. It is a clinically observable, neurologically measurable state of captivity, one that the highest-earning professionals in the world are actively living inside right now, at this exact moment, without a single diagnostic code attached to their suffering. You, the person listening to this, you probably already know the feeling, not the feeling of poverty. The other one, the feeling of making more money than 94% of the humans on this planet and still waking up at 3:15 in the morning with your hand hovering over your phone, not to check a threat, to check a number that never, never feels like enough. That is not a character flaw. That is fMRI cortisol damage running on a biological schedule you did not design and were never warned about. My name is irrelevant. What matters is this. By the time this ends, you'll understand, with the precision of a Nobel laureate and the unflinching clarity of a behavioral forensics report, exactly why your golden handcuffs are not made of gold. They are made of your own neurobiology, and the system that built them knew exactly what it was doing. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus is 36 years old. He is a senior engineering manager at one of 5 companies that collectively control more digital infrastructure than every government on Earth combined. His total compensation package, base bonus, RSU vesting schedule, clears $340,000 annually. His LinkedIn profile has been viewed in the last 30 days by 47 recruiters. He has not responded to a single one, not because the offers aren't compelling, because responding would require him to confront a question he has spent 4 years, 6 months, and approximately 11,000 hours of Slack activity actively avoiding. The question is simple. If I leave, what? Exactly. A.M. It is 3:17 in the morning. Marcus is not asleep. He is sitting at a kitchen island made of honed Calicut marble, a surface that costs more than the annual salary of the teacher who first told him he was gifted. And he is doing what he does every night when the architecture of his own mind becomes too loud to ignore. He is opening Zillow, not to buy anything. He knows that. His prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved structure in the human brain, the seat of judgment, of long-range planning, of the capacity to override impulse. His prefrontal cortex knows that he cannot afford another property, not in any real sense, not in the sense that matters. Because lifestyle inflation has consumed the delta between what Marcus earns and what Marcus owns with the quiet efficiency of a biological process. Every raise has been metabolized. Every bonus has been absorbed. The lifestyle creep illusion, the persistent dopamine-mediated belief that the next acquisition will finally produce a sensation of arrival, has run its program flawlessly for the better part of a decade. Here's what the Neuroscience says about that process. Stanford University's research on dopamine baseline mechanics, specifically the work examining reward prediction error in chronically high-income subjects, demonstrates something that the financial industry will never voluntarily put in a prospectus. When reward is predictable, when it arrives on schedule, when it is, as Marcus's direct deposit is, as reliable as a biological function, the dopamine system does not celebrate. It habituates. The baseline drops. The hedonic threshold shifts upward, and the organism, meaning Marcus, meaning you, requires progressively larger stimuli simply to maintain a neutral emotional state. Not happiness. Neutral. This is what Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and economist Angus Deaton documented in their landmark 2010 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Their finding was precise and devastating in equal measure. Beyond an emotional security threshold, documented at approximately $75,000 to $100,000 annually, additional income ceases to generate measurable increases in day-to-day emotional well-being. What it generates instead is an escalating architecture of identity spending trap, the compulsive acquisition of objects whose real function is not utility, not even pleasure, but the suppression of an existential signal the brain is trying desperately to transmit. The Omega Speedmaster on Marcus's left wrist. The Pinarello Dogma F cycling frame hanging in a garage he parks in front of because a Tesla takes the space inside. The tasting menu reservations that he photographs and does not fully taste. None of these are purchases. They are analgesics. Carl Jung, the architect of the most penetrating psychological framework ever applied to high-achieving men, called this the Carl Jung shadow persona collapse. The persona is the mask, the curated, high-resolution, publicly legible version of the self. Marcus has built a persona of extraordinary precision, the engineering leader, the provider, the man who made it, the man who, when his father asks how work is going at Thanksgiving, can answer a number large enough to end the conversation entirely. But the shadow, Jung's term for the aggregate of everything the persona, requires you to suppress. The shadow does not disappear because the persona is polished. It compounds. Marcus wanted to be an architect, not a metaphorical one, a literal one. He wanted to design buildings, physical structures that would exist in 3 dimensions and cast actual shadows on actual ground. He was 22 when he abandoned that. The calculation was rational. Engineering paid more. The system rewarded the pivot. The system always rewards a pivot that moves you deeper into dependency. And here is where the neurobiology of wealth becomes something darker than a productivity problem. Harvard Medical School researcher Dr. Herbert Benson's work on the neuroplasticity of the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection architecture, demonstrates that chronic, low-grade financial anxiety does not simply feel unpleasant. It restructures the brain. The amygdala, operating under sustained cortisol exposure, begins to interpret the absence of salary as a survival threat equivalent in neurological weight to physical predation. The organism cannot distinguish between a layoff notice and a predator. Both trigger the same cascade, which means Marcus is not anxious about money. Marcus is, at the cellular level, afraid for his life. Every single morning. And the system, the architecture of fiat inflation matrix that the Federal Reserve economic data has been quietly tracking for 3 consecutive decades, that system is not indifferent to Marcus's fear. It depends on it. Fred data on lifestyle inflation among high-income earners in the technology sector shows a structural pattern that is almost elegant in its brutality. As nominal compensation increases, fixed cost obligations, mortgages, insurance premiums, private school tuitions, the gravitational weight of persona, scale in near-perfect lockstep. Marcus received a 14% compensation increase 18 months ago. His net monthly discretionary cash, the liquid, deployable money that actually constitutes financial agency, decreased by $912 in the same period. The net negative raise. Not a theory. A number. His number. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, mathematician, epistemologist, author of Skin in the Game and the Bed of Procrustes, identified this mechanism with the surgical economy of a man who has no patience for comfortable lies. Taleb wrote that the 3 most dangerous addictions available to a human being are heroin, carbohydrates, and a monthly salary. What he was identifying was not moral weakness. He was identifying a structural dependency, a state in which the organism's capacity for risk tolerance, for autonomous action, for what he calls genuine skin in the game, has been systematically atrophied by the regularity of the reward. Marcus has not taken a real risk since 2019. He knows this. He knows that the way you know a room has changed temperature, not from a reading, from your body. He knows it when he sits in his 4 consecutive quarterly review and delivers feedback with the careful, diplomatic imprecision of a man who has calculated exactly how honest he can afford to be. He knows it when he approves a performance improvement plan for the engineer on his team, who reminds him, uncomfortably, of who he was at 28, before the subconscious money scripts took over. Before the system installed its operating logic inside the architecture of his ambition, and he stopped being able to tell the difference between what he wanted and what he had been rewarded for wanting. He fired that engineer. He bought a bottle of Yamazaki 18 the same week. $1,100. He told himself it was a gift to himself for a difficult decision handled professionally. His amygdala knew the actual transaction. His prefrontal cortex, the structure that Dr. Amy Aronson at Yale School of Medicine has documented loses dendritic spine density under chronic stress exposure, literally shrinking its own capacity for rational deliberation. His prefrontal cortex was simply not online enough to intervene. This is the high earner-broke syndrome in its clinical form, not broke in the sense of empty bank accounts. Broke in the sense of the mechanism of agency, the biological, psychological, financial infrastructure required to make a different choice, has been so thoroughly compromised by the architecture of the trap that the trap no longer requires walls. The prisoner guards himself. And Marcus, sitting at his Calicut marble island at 3:17 in the morning, scrolling through houses in Vermont he will never buy, with his amygdala neuroplasticity running a threat assessment program in the background that has not been switched off in approximately 4 years, Marcus is about to ask himself the question, not the Zillow question, not the compensation question, not the question about whether the next RSU vest will finally be enough. The real one, how did I get here? And is there a way out? Before Marcus, before the mortgage, before the stock options and the Calicut marble and the Yamazaki 18 that cost more than some people's monthly rent, there was a plan, not a conspiracy, not a shadowed room of men in identical suits making coordinated decisions in bad lighting, something more precise than that, and therefore more difficult to argue with, a structural plan, an architectural one, the kind that does not require coordination once it is built, because the building itself does the work. Let's go back to 1903. Frederick Taylor Gates, advisor to John D. Rockefeller and the primary intellectual architect of the General Education Board, funded by Rockefeller Capital and chartered in that year with the explicit mandate of restructuring American public education, Gates wrote something in the board's foundational documents that has never required concealment, because it has never required reading. He wrote, "In our dream we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk." Read that again, not as a historical artifact, as an engineering specification. Perfect docility. Our molding hand. Our own goodwill. The General Education Board did not fund schools that taught children to build enterprises. It funded schools that taught children to follow instructions, to arrive on time, to sit in rows, to raise their hands before speaking, to measure their worth in grades, which is to say, in the assessment of an authority external to themselves, and then, upon graduation, to transfer that same psychological architecture wholesale into the corporation, into the cubicle, into the annual performance review conducted by a manager who is himself conducting the same transfer upward. The Prussian school system employee was not an accident history. It was the product of a deliberate institutional investment made at the precise moment when industrial capitalism required a workforce that was educated enough to be useful and conditioned enough not to question the terms of its own employment. Marcus sat in those rows. He raised his hand. He received excellent grades. He was told repeatedly and with genuine warmth that he was exceptional. And he was. The system does not trap mediocre people with this particular mechanism. It reserves the golden handcuff psychology for the exceptional ones, the ones whose capability makes them valuable enough to pay at a level that forecloses the psychological space required to imagine an alternative. But before the education system, before the corporation, before the RSU vesting schedule, there was the language. You use 2 words every day that contain, encoded in their oldest roots, the precise terms of the contract you sign without reading it. The first word is salary, from the Latin salarium, the ration of salt issued to Roman soldiers as partial compensation for military service. Salt, not because it was precious, though it was, but because it was a minimum biological requirement for a soldier to remain functional in the field. The salary was not designed to make the soldier wealthy. It was designed to keep him operational, to maintain the asset, to ensure the fighting capacity of a body that belonged, for the duration of its contract, to the empire. Your direct deposit is a salt ration, calibrated, not to your freedom, but to your continued functionality inside a system that requires your presence more than your prosperity. The second word is mortgage, from the Old French and Latin. Mort, death. Gage, pledge. A pledge that terminates upon death, either the death of the debt or the death of the debtor. whichever arrives first. The instrument that Marcus signed, the document that transferred $1.8 million of liability onto his personal balance sheet and anchored his neurobiology to a monthly payment schedule for the next 27 years. That instrument is, in the oldest layer of its own language, a dead pledge. The system did not hide this. It translated it. It repackaged the dead pledge as the American dream, handed it to Marcus at the precise moment his dopamine detox capacity was at its lowest. After the first child, the promotion, the peer pressure of the neighborhood comp, and Marcus signed it. Because the alternative required a kind of psychological freedom that the system had been quietly, systematically, and generationally removing from him since the age of 6. Now layer on top of this the Federal Reserve economic data, FRED, and the mechanism becomes almost elegant in its completeness. The fiat inflation matrix is not a political position. It is a data set. Federal Reserve tracking of real wage growth against asset price inflation across the last 4 decades shows a structural divergence that no financial advisor will frame this plainly in a client meeting. The assets that generate passive income, real estate, equity, intellectual property, cash-flowing business ownership, have appreciated at a rate that systematically outpaces the wage growth available to even the highest compensated employees, which means the harder Marcus works, the more precisely he is running in place. Not because he is not exceptional, because the track is designed to move beneath his feet at the exact speed of his acceleration. The net negative raise is not a bad year. It is a system operating as specified. Nassim Nicholas Taleb's framework in Skin in the Game provides the analytical architecture for understanding why this persists despite being, once articulated, obviously visible. Taleb's argument is not about wealth. It is about asymmetry. The employee has skin in the game in the sense that he can be harmed, fired, restructured, made redundant by an algorithm, but he has no skin in the game in the sense that matters. He cannot capture the upside of the value he creates. The delta between what Marcus generates for his employer and what Marcus receives in compensation is not a negotiation outcome. It is a structural feature of the employment contract itself. The contract that the Prussian school system employee architecture spent 20 years preparing him to accept as natural, inevitable, and proof of his own success. Marcus has generated, by conservative internal estimation, somewhere between $12 and $18 million of enterprise value in his current role over the last 4 years. His total compensation in that period was approximately $1.3 million. Carl Jung spent 40 years studying what he called the Carl Jung shadow persona dynamic in high-achieving men, and what he found consistently beneath the polished surface of professional accomplishment was not contentment, was not even ambition, was a grief for the unlived life, for the version of the self that had been sacrificed to the construction of the persona, the mask that the world rewarded, the mask that the system had shaped with such precision that the man wearing it had long since forgotten it was a mask at all. Marcus's unlived life is architecture, literal, physical, three-dimensional architecture. He has not thought about this consciously in years. The subconscious money scripts have buried it under enough layers of compensation narrative that it rarely surfaces. But at 3:17 in the morning, when the persona's maintenance systems are running low and the shadow moves through the unguarded rooms of his mind, he thinks about a building he designed at 22. A community library in a small city, a structure he drew by hand, in pencil, over 4 months of evenings, that would have let natural light into a reading room in a way that made the act of reading feel like something worth doing. He never built it. He pivoted. The system rewarded the pivot. The library does not exist. And neither, in any meaningful sense, does the Marcus who would have built it. Now here is where the hidden wealth architecture becomes visible. And I want you to pay attention to this, because this is the mechanism that the Capgemini World Wealth Report, tracking high net worth individuals with liquid assets above $1 million, identified as a structural differentiator between the people who escape the high income trap and the people who fund their own captivity with increasing sophistication. The distinction is not income. Marcus's income. The distinction is not net worth. Marcus has net worth. $1.8 million in home equity, approximately $400,000 invested RSUs, a retirement account that looks impressive in an annual statement, and is structurally illiquid until he is 67 years old. The distinction is cash flow sovereignty. The high net worth individuals in the Capgemini data are not, in the main, people who earn more than Marcus. They are people who, at a specific inflection point, often earlier, often with less total capital, redirected their energy from the accumulation of earned income toward the construction of cash-flowing assets. Assets that generate returns independent of their physical presence. Assets that do not require them to sit in a quarterly review and calculate, in real time, exactly how honest they can afford to be. Wallace D. Wattles, writing in The Science of Getting Rich in 1910, a text so structurally precise that has been quietly studied by institutional wealth managers who would never publicly cite it, identified a distinction that the entire architecture of systemic economic illusion is designed to obscure. He called it the difference between the competitive mind and the creative mind. The competitive mind operates inside the system's existing terms. It fights for a larger share of a fixed resource, a better title, a higher compensation band, a more favorable performance review. It is, by definition, a zero-sum operation conducted inside a structure that was built by and for the interests of the people who own the structure. Marcus has a competitive mind of extraordinary caliber. That is why the system pays him $340,000 a year to keep it fully occupied. The creative mind does not compete for resources. It generates them. It operates outside the system's accounting, in the space where new value is created rather than redistributed. Wattles called this a certain way, not a mystical prescription, but a structural orientation, a decision about which game you are playing and whose rules you are playing by. Marcus has not made that decision, not because he lacks the intelligence, not because he lacks the capital, because the decision requires something the system has spent 30 years methodically removing from his psychological inventory. It requires a belief, not the hope, the belief that he exists independently of the salary, that he has an identity, a capability, a generative capacity that does not dissolve the moment the direct deposit stops. And this is where the science stops, and something older begins. Neville Goddard, metaphysician, mystic, one of the most structurally precise thinkers about the relationship between consciousness and material reality that the 20th century produced, wrote in The Power of Awareness that a human being does not attract what they want. They attract what they are, not what they earn, not what they own, what they are. And Marcus, at 3:17 in the morning, with the cortisol running its scheduled program through a prefrontal cortex that Yale's Dr. Amy Arnson has documented loses literal dendritic mass under this precise quality of chronic stress. Marcus is a mortgage. Marcus is the quarterly review. Marcus is the carefully calculated honesty and the fired engineer and the Yamazaki 18 and the library that was never built, not because that is who he is, because that is the state he occupies. And the state he occupies is a state he will continue to generate, materially, financially, biologically, until something interrupts the program. The question is not whether Marcus can escape. The question is whether Marcus understands, with sufficient precision, what he is escaping from, and what he must become before the escape is architecturally possible. Because the exit is not a financial event. It never was. Let us talk about what actually changes things. Not the productivity framework you downloaded and abandoned. Not the side hustle you started on a Tuesday in February and quietly stopped mentioning by April. Not the therapy that correctly identified the anxiety but could not address the structural conditions producing it. The thing that actually changes things. Harvard Medical School's Dr. Herbert Benson spent 3 decades studying what he called the relaxation response, the neurological counterprogram to the amygdala's threat cascade. What his research demonstrated, and what has since been corroborated by placebo and nocebo studies published in Nature, is something that sounds, on first encounter, almost offensively simple. The brain cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined state and an experienced one, not as poetry, as neuroimaging data. The same prefrontal structures that Dr. Amy Arnson at Yale School of Medicine documented losing dendritic density under chronic cortisol exposure. Those same structures rebuild under sustained, coherent, emotionally grounded visualization of an alternative state. The brain that has been architecturally deformed by 4 years of fMRI cortisol damage is not permanently deformed. It is plastic. It responds to the quality and consistency of its own dominant signal, which means Marcus's first problem is not his mortgage. It is not his compensation structure. It is not his vesting schedule or his fixed cost obligations or the gravitational pull of persona he has been constructing since the General Education Board's institutional descendants handed him his first performance review at age 7. Marcus's first problem is the state he occupies. And this is where Neville Goddard becomes not a mystical curiosity, but a precision instrument. Goddard wrote, in The Power of Awareness, in 1952, in language so structurally exact that it has survived 70 years of material culture, attempting to dilute it into affirmation posters, that consciousness is the only reality, not as philosophical abstraction, as operational instruction. The state you occupy, meaning the aggregate emotional, cognitive, and identity-level reality you inhabit as your baseline, is a state you will continue to generate in the material world, not because the universe is listening, because you are. Because every decision, every response, every micro-calculation of risk and possibility runs to filter the state you have accepted as true about yourself. Marcus has accepted a state. The state has a name. Neville Goddard's state of freedom, the concept Goddard built his entire framework around, is not a feeling. It is not an aspiration. It is a prior commitment. A decision made in the absence of material evidence, held with enough neurological consistency that the brain's threat assessment architecture begins, gradually, measurably, to recalibrate around it. This is not soft. This is not motivational. This is the hardest thing Marcus will ever do. Harder than the engineering degree. Harder than the FANG interview. Harder than a quarterly review where he fired the engineer who reminded him of himself, because it requires him to occupy a state of sovereignty before the bank account confirms it, to make the identity shift prior to the material evidence, to decide at 3:17 in the morning on a Calicut marble island that he is not the mortgage, that he never was. Now, let me give you the structural framework, because the exit protocol wealth is not metaphysical alone. It is a sequence, and the sequence has a specific order that the hidden wealth architecture of the genuinely free, the people who have actually walked out of the trap, follows with remarkable consistency. The first move is not financial. It is perceptual. Before Marcus redirects a single dollar, before he restructures a single obligation, before he has a single conversation with a wealth manager about cash-flowing assets versus earned income, he must perform what Taleb, in Skin in the Game, calls the asymmetry audit, a ruthlessly honest accounting of where he actually has skin in the game versus where he merely has exposure, where he is building something that compounds his absence versus where he is trading irreplaceable time for a depreciating asset called salary. The audit is not comfortable. It is not designed to be. It is designed to make the cognitive dissonance in finance visible, to surface the gap between the story Marcus tells at dinner parties and the spreadsheet that exists when no one is watching. The gap between the net worth number that sounds like freedom and the liquidity number that determines whether Marcus can survive 90 days without a direct deposit. For most high-income earners in Marcus's demographic, that number, the genuine, liquid, deployable cash available without triggering asset liquidation or debt, is between 45 and 90 days of operating expenses. 90 days. A man with a $340,000 salary and a $1.8 million property and $400,000 in RSUs. 90 days from a state that his subconscious money scripts tell him is poverty. That is not wealth. That is a longer runway to the same destination. The second move is the identity separation. Marcus must surgically, deliberately, and repeatedly practice the cognitive act of distinguishing between what he earns and what he is. This is not affirmation work. This is structural neurological reprogramming. The kind that Dr. Benson's research demonstrated requires consistent, daily practice over a minimum of 66 days before the amygdala's threat response to income disruption begins to measurably de-escalate. Marcus must practice being, in the privacy of his own cognition, the architect, the builder, the man whose value exists independently of whether a FANG payroll system processes his biweekly deposit, not because the money stops matching, because the fear must stop driving. A decision made from fear produces a fear-shaped outcome. Every time, without exception. This is not philosophy. This is a behavioral economics literature, Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, rendered into a single operational instruction. You cannot build metaphysical wealth frequency from a cortisol baseline. The neurobiology does not permit it. The third move is the cash flow pivot, not the abandonment of salary, not the dramatic resignation letter that feels, in imagination, like liberation and produces, in practice, a different species of panic, the gradual, systematic construction of income streams that generate returns independent of Marcus's physical presence, cash-flowing assets, intellectual property, equity in enterprises where his genuine skin in the game built alongside the salary, funded by the recaptured delta of lifestyle inflation reversed, until the passive income crosses the threshold of his fixed obligations. At that crossing, and not before, the golden handcuff psychology loses its biological grip, because the amygdala's threat response is not triggered by the idea of leaving. It is triggered by the material reality of dependency. Remove the dependency. The fear does not survive the surgery. Wallace D. Wattles understood this 115 years ago. The creative mind, the mind operating outside the competitive frame of the existing system, does not generate wealth by taking from others. It generates wealth by adding to the total quantity of value in the world, by building things that did not exist, by designing, in Marcus's case, the architectural equivalent of a reading room where natural light does something worth feeling, the library he never built. Carl Jung called the integration of the shadow, the reclamation of the unlived life, individuation, not happiness, not even freedom, exactly, something more precise, the state of being whole, the state in which the persona and the shadow are no longer at war, in which the mask is worn consciously, because it serves a chosen purpose rather than unconsciously, because the system requires it for continued compensation. Marcus does not need to burn his offer letter. He needs to stop being it. And here is what that looks like in practice. Not in theory. In the body. In the room. It looks like a man sitting at a Calicut Marble Island at 3:17 in the morning who closes the Zillow application, not because he has suppressed a desire, because he has recognized it for what it is, a dopamine detox signal, a biological notification that the high-income trap is running its maintenance cycle through his nervous system, and he has chosen, with the cold precision of someone who has finally read the contract in its original language, not to respond. He opens, instead, a different document, not a spreadsheet, not a compensation analysis. Something is not open in 4 years, a folder of architectural sketches, rough, penciled, structurally imperfect, and absolutely alive. He does not know yet what he will do with them. He does not need to. He needs only to occupy, for the first time in 4 years, the state of the man who made them, the state of someone whose value is not contingent on a quarterly review, whose identity is not a function of a vesting schedule, whose freedom is not a number he is waiting to earn permission to feel. Goddard called this Neville Goddard's state of freedom, the acceptance, prior to evidence, of a reality more true than the one the system has been generating on your behalf. It is not passive. It is the most aggressive act available to a human being operating inside a system designed for his compliance. But I need to tell you something that the exit protocol well frameworks, the financial independence movements, the early retirement architectures, the entire cultural apparatus that has spent the last decade selling freedom as a number, none of them will tell you, because Marcus is going to do the work. Some version of Marcus, some version of you, is going to perform the asymmetry audit, execute the identity separation, build a cash flow architecture brick by deliberate brick, and arrive, after months or years of the most psychologically demanding construction project of his life, at the number that was supposed to be the answer. $1 million saved. Liquid, deployable, the high earner broke syndrome in full reversal, the mortgage restructured, the RSUs cashed, the fixed obligations reduced to a level that the passive income stream covers without touching the principal. And on the morning after Marcus crosses that threshold, on the morning he wakes up for the first time as a man who does not need the salary, he is going to feel something that no one in the FIRE movement prepared him for. Not freedom, a different kind of trapped, because the wealth frequency he built was constructed, in large part, as a reaction to the system, to the cortisol, to the dead pledge and the salt ration and the quarterly review. And a life built as a reaction to a prison is not a free life. It is a prison with better lighting. The FIRE movement trap, the compulsive accumulation of a specific number, the worship of the savings rate, the reduction of a human life to a withdrawal percentage, is not the opposite of the high-income trap. It is its mirror image. Same fear, different costume. The question that Marcus, that you, will face on the morning after the number is reached is not a financial question. It never was. It is a question that the Neville Goddard state of freedom was always pointing toward, beneath the wealth mechanics, beneath the cash flow architecture, beneath every layer of the system's conditioning. Who are you when you are not running from something? That question has an answer, but the answer is not in this document. Because saving $1 million, reaching the number, crossing the fire threshold, achieving the metric that an entire movement has told you constitutes liberation, that is not the end of the trap. It is the beginning of understanding why the fire movement trap and why saving $1 million is keeping you poor, not in your bank account, but in the only currency that was ever worth accumulating, your capacity to build something that did not exist before you decided to build it. The library is still waiting.